productivity, winning strategies, and aligning employer-employee goals. If this sounds like something your business could use more of, then you've come to the right place. The Business Mechanic Show with your host, Vaughn Sigmund. Let Vaughn show you how to develop, improve, and jumpstart your business. So now, please welcome the host of The Business Mechanic, Vaughn Sigmund.
Welcome to the Business Mechanic Show. Today, once again, I'm so excited to have my partners, Tony Penn and Danny Lands, with me to talk about one of our very favorite topics, one of our best-selling training programs, which is performance management that works. And as I was thinking about doing this podcast today, there's a couple things I wanted to be able to cover to help people understand maybe our journey and how we learned not only the importance, but the how-to. That it's critical. We can talk a lot about the importance and what it means, but we really got to come down to what the instruction manual is on how to deliver feedback, because employees really love feedback. It's been proven over and over again. And they love it because they know where they stand. They feel like they're learning and growing. It shows that their boss cares about them and their success. And when a boss or a supervisor or a leader withholds that, they feel neglected. They feel left out. There's a lack of connection that gets created between you and your direct reports, your team members. So a lot of bad can come from it, but almost all feedback, when delivered properly, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is how to deliver it properly. Just the value that builds in driving your success as a leader, as a business owner, as an executive in an organization. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Danny now, because Danny, we all had to learn somehow. And I had my journey to learning proper feedback. Tell me how you learned to give performance feedback successfully.
Thank you, Vaughn. I think one of the big game changers in my career, if I can give a shameless plug, was actually going through a performance management course when I was at Eaton Corporation, which is a big industrialized, diversified company. And they actually had some pretty good programs. They had finance for non-finance managers, and they had how to give an evaluation, how to do performance management. I'd say the biggest takeaway I got from that class, and it stuck with me for many years after, was people generally don't like surprises. And if you wait and sit on feedback, especially constructive feedback, and then give it at a much later date, people typically don't enjoy that surprise. They don't enjoy not knowing that they could have had that feedback 6 months ago and corrected the issue. And instead, we as a leader sat on it. So that really reinforced for me the importance of frequency, which we've talked about before, giving the feedback often. And the other thing that I think is really important is to always mix in positive feedback, to make sure that if you're doing it frequently, then there's always going to be something positive to say. If you wait until, what hits the fan, then you're going to be focused on the negative thing. And it's often going to be a surprise, and people don't respond well to surprises. So I think the biggest takeaway I got from that class, and it stuck with me forever, and I realized it really works, is to deal with things when they happen. Don't let them linger, don't let them fester, because then it's a real surprise to people when they find out that was a big issue to you, and maybe they didn't think it was a big issue to them.
Yeah, I heard two really important parts out of that, Danny, is don't delay, address the instance or the situation as quickly as possible. Another thing that you're a big fan of saying is don't do it when there's any kind of emotion on your part, especially any kind of anger. You want to give it a day. The 24-hour rule, we call that, let it die down a little bit. And the second part is make sure you're contributing enough positive in there. I learned early on the importance of the emotional bank account. It's a great visual for me that I've shared with hundreds of people through the years. And that emotional bank account is if you're not making regular positive deposits into positive feedback to your team members, then when you have to go and give them some developmental feedback or address poor behavior, if you've got enough of a balance from your positive deposits, that withdrawal will not deplete your account and ruin the relationship or ruin the morale of that individual. So that's an important point you made. So thank you, Danny. And I'll turn it over to you now, Tony. How did you learn the steps of delivering performance feedback?
Well, thanks for having me on, Vaughn. A lot of what I learned early on was a class in how not to evaluate performance, mainly because I come from the restaurant industry, and the restaurant industry is just racked with regurgitated information where people are constantly looking at outdated old review forms. And to Danny's point, they're not doing them very frequently. They sit down and they go through a laundry list of items where maybe 20 to 25% are tied into what you actually do on a day-to-day basis that actually fit the job description that you have. It's just a generic standard form. So one of the things I learned from how not to do that was to create feedback forms from the job description itself, and to be as specific as possible to line up what the expectations were with how you were being evaluated. And to both you both brought up, Danny brought up about surprises. It should never be a surprise. You should never be surprised as someone that's being reviewed when you sit down, because it's happening regularly, like we talked about on the last podcast, and you're being thorough, but you're also being documented and things are being discussed based upon your actual job performance related to your actual job description. So I just took job descriptions and I spent a lot of time on those. And then I lined up the performance appraisals to those job descriptions. And then the last thing I would tell you is the process of how you evaluate somebody is something that is learned over a period of time. But one of the most important characteristics of someone that's doing an effective job as an evaluator is the ability to listen. Because it's one thing to have and feel a little bit self-righteous that you have all the information about how somebody's performing, but you're not listening to the whys, because all of this ties into how am I going to get better results? Not how am I going to feel better that I told them everything that they need to work on, positive and negative. I'm looking for better results. And how do I get those results? One way and believe me, it took a while, because you get in those positions where you think you got it all figured out. But I started doing a much better job of listening to what these individuals were going through and what made them tick, so that when I was determining what kind of performance goal process or what I needed from them in the future, I can easily tie that in to some of these nuggets that I've learned about them. And because anybody that's been in a leadership position understands that everybody is wired differently, and it's not the same level of supervision that's needed for everybody. Everybody's different, but you're never going to learn that if you don't listen. So that really helped me.
Yeah, and that listening part too is I've learned, because I've stepped on it. I've made this mistake more times than I care to admit. None of us are perfect. Let's make that abundantly clear. But I've stepped on this a few times. Is I've been told that somebody did this or was screwing this up or made this mistake, and I go in with both barrels and are addressing this without ever asking a question. And then they're sitting there, they've got that look on their face. They're not enjoying this any more than really maybe you're enjoying it. And then you get done with your feedback to them, this one-way downloaded feedback, and you stop and you take a breath and they say, that's not quite how it happened. there's another side to the story that once you get it and you listen, it's like, oh, I'm an idiot. Why did I go do that? I've just set myself up to look very foolish. that's such an important point is you have to always, in my belief, ask instead of tell. You have to take that Socratic approach when you're giving feedback. Tell me how you're doing. What do you think about this? Why did you choose to do it that way? Rather than come in with this very direct feedback that often is not going to be heard very well because the receiver of this has got their defenses up and they don't want to hear it the way you're giving it to them. So the turning on that listening skill and asking questions, getting their feedback, getting their viewpoint on it so that you're not so dogmatic in your approach is really key. So thanks for bringing that up. And it's even before we even started today, and I said this was going to be, we did plan a little bit. We don't plan a lot on these, but I did say, hey, we're going to talk about how we learn to give developmental feedback. And it's funny that Danny learned from Eaton. Tony, you went to a class and learned from it. I learned from a class too. Fortunately, I was in my early 20s. I had a very forward-thinking leader, boss that I was working for. He sent me, and it was in Portland, Maine. I was working for a company based out of Maine at the time, and they brought up all the regional managers in to go through this week-long leadership training. And this was one part that I carried with me. It was more business solutions. It was a training company. I don't know whether they're still around anymore or not, but we spent a half a day learning how to give performance or developmental feedback, give feedback to people on both positive and their opportunities, and role playing. And that was my first introduction to role playing. And at first, I think most people, and Danny and Tony, I bet you're the same way. I hated that role play, and I don't need this. I'm embarrassed. It's our self-esteem being challenged. But man, by the time you got to the second or third role play, one, you realized how bad you were without this training, without practicing it. And then once you got through the third or fourth one, you felt really good. Your confidence was super high. And you also now knew how to do it because you'd had a few repetitions at it. It's something that I carried the rest of my life. And I guess the moral to that story is it's rare. It's almost impossible to learn how to do this critical part of your job as a leader or as a manager without some type of training. Yes, that's a little bit of a shameless plug for our performance management that works training, or any of our workshops or seminars that we put on a regular basis. But there's a right way, and then there's every other way. And it's impossible to argue that the right way works. And you've got to learn from somebody. And that's what all of this is about. And some of the key elements I think that we've got to think about in the hows to this is you got to make the time. This can't be, if you're on a regular performance management cadence, which is Danny and Tony, you both brought this up. I certainly followed this for years and years, is you got to make the time. You've got to schedule that time. It's not going to present itself. You can't do it ad hoc. You can't do it on the fly. It's got to be a time-blocked schedule event on a regular basis. Our training, and the three of us are strong believers that a formal one-on-one sit down with each of your team members, your direct reports, every single month is essential. The whole concept of an annual review, anything that's over a month, is pretty worthless. And so you've got to perform these feedback sessions with a balance between objective, subjective, which we go into a great deal of detail in our training about that. What are their numbers? What are their behaviors that drive those numbers? And you've got to do that on a regular basis. Back to Danny's point is, nobody likes to be surprised. Nobody likes to be told at the end of the year they've been average when they thought they've been doing an above average or an exceptional job all year, or worse yet, that they've been doing a lousy job. And you had a whole year to tell me you haven't. That's so unfair. So it's scheduling the time, it's making the time, and there's like we said in the last podcast, there's eyes roll into from a lot of people who are thinking, I don't have time to do this. Friends, you don't have time not to do this, because it saves you. When you're in this regular cadence, you're giving this feedback, you are saving yourself a ton of additional work, because things simply go smoother, much smoother. So time block it. It's a huge ROI on that time. You have to approach it as a coach. And then last, and this is all included in our training as well, is the documents to capture it, because you want to be able to not keep a trail of negative, but you want to keep a trail of all performance over a year's time. So if in fact you want to do an annual review, it's 12 components, 12 months of documentation, so you remember it. Yeah, I can't remember things from week to week anymore, sometimes day to day. If you don't document, take some notes so that you've got something to refer back to. That's really important. Again, we give you all the forms, we give you the instructions on how to use those forms. You can edit them and make them your own if you want to, but at the very least, you've got to do it monthly. 30 to 45 minutes is all it takes. It prevents you a ton of firefighting. You can review their rocks, their objectives, their plans. It keeps you in touch with what's happening with them. That's the discussion you want to have with them every month, and it's super valuable. And Danny, back in your old life, did you look forward to, or did you dread your monthly reviews?
That it depended on the employee, right? The ones that were doing great, I looked forward to talking to them. And if I'm being honest, the ones that were underperforming, I didn't really look forward to those conversations. And I'm guilty of, at times in my career, kicking the can down the road on some of those conversations with some of the people that were driving me crazy or just didn't want the feedback. But as you say, I think making it very conversational, as Tony says, making it about the results, making it about objective, measurable results, and saying, look, the results aren't there, so what do you want to do differently to get the results, right? If they're not willing to listen to what you suggest to do differently, then sometimes you can turn it on them and say, if the results aren't there, what would you do differently to get it there, and get them to sign up for some actions, get them to sign up for a plan that maybe will turn the corner or turn a metric around. So, but yeah, I mean, I think it's, for most of us, we don't enjoy giving negative feedback. The people that do enjoy negative feedback probably aren't very fun to work for, because I think the best leaders I've worked for, the ones that I wanted to go into my performance review and receive a performance feedback from, were all pretty compassionate people that wanted to have a two-way conversation about performance and wanted to help me get better. And so I always tried to approach it as, how can I help this person achieve more in their career, if that's what they're interested in, or more happiness in their career if they're mainly just want to stick with the same job but be happier or less stressed. I tried to find out what motivated them. Some people it's money, some people it's career status, some people it's just being able to go home at 5 o'clock. And if you know what each individual team member's motivations are, then you can cater to that with your performance conversations. And if you can make their working life better, they will move mountains for you. That's what I found.
So true. Good points. And from my own perspective, being the competitor I always was in business, still, I really looked forward to receiving my monthly review, because I was so driven in driving the numbers and performance and my accomplishments and getting things done so that I could, it was so motivational to me to know that on a certain date every month, I got to tell my boss how great I was. And also at the same time, I've been a lifelong learner, and sometimes as painful as it could be to get some direction on something you're underachieving or not performing at very well, as painful as it might have been at the moment receiving that, I always benefited from it. I always learned something from it. I never really looked at my boss and said, what an a-hole. They don't know. They have no idea what they're talking about, because my bosses, I was so lucky to have so many good ones. I had some bad ones, but I had some really good ones. By the way, the bad ones never gave monthly reviews. The good ones always did. But the good ones always had struck a nice balance between positive and developmental. But they always had developmental. They were always challenging me. And it is that challenge that I thrived on, because the next month I wanted to show them that I had accomplished that. It was super motivational.
You know what? That we're human beings. That's how we're motivated. That's how we're wired, is we want to be accepted and we want to be validated as human beings and as part of the team. And having somebody that you really respected, that carried some power within the organization, it was a great feeling.
I have a form, and this form needs to have two parts to it, subjective and an objective, understanding that all the numbers, this is a very important point that many individuals, leading people, miss, that the numbers are important, but those numbers are an indicator of behaviors. And you cannot focus the discussion around the numbers. You've got to focus the discussions, the development, and the feedback on the behaviors that drive the numbers. And that's such a subtle but very important part of what these discussions need to be about. And Tony and Danny both talked about it, is the how to. How do you influence improvements and success? It's the actions you take, the behaviors you exhibit. So it's got to be monthly. It's got to be two parts, subjective and objective. Everybody needs to have targets. There's a book that I recommend everybody in management read, and it's called The Game of Work. And I don't get paid for this, but it is a really important book from Charles Cunard. And I'll spell the last name, Conradt. It's all about the importance in the neuroscience of giving your team members objective numbers to shoot for, and more importantly, how to come up with them. A lot of companies struggle with measurables and KPIs and that sort of thing. So they got to have the objective, the numbers. They've got to have the subjective, which is the behaviors, the soft part of what drives the numbers. It needs to be documented. It needs to be regularly scheduled. So you've got to make the time on a regular basis to do that. Keep it in a form. When you begin the next month's review, you bring out the previous month's form. You talk about what you talked about briefly in the previous month. Most importantly, the end of every review is going to have to be, okay, what are your plans? What are your goals for achievement for the coming month? So that they tell you what actions they're going to take, what focuses they're going to have, what to-dos they're going to get checked off. So they understand exactly what's expected of them. And you know exactly what they're working on for the most part. And so you stay on the same page with your direct reports by, in the very end, okay, what are you going to go work on? What are your goals? What are your achievements? What are your action plans for the coming month? So that you know very clearly, and they know from you very clearly, what's expected of them. Document it, schedule it, and make sure the frequency of it is established, clear, and is never canceled. You can't cancel these either. I'll start wrapping it up with that. Danny, any final words from you before we close out this podcast?
I think you brought up a really excellent point, Vaughn, that I benefited from in the class I did. And I would say it's true of several kinds of conversations that people don't, like a performance management conversation, that people don't inherently get ready for in life. There aren't those kinds of conversations in life necessarily, that, or if they are, we don't necessarily learn how to do them. I think what you meant, a point you made about actually doing some mock sessions, doing some performance management mock conversations and some rehearsals can be really beneficial if you're a little bit nervous going into these kinds of conversations. And you can work with your fellow person there that you're rehearsing with to understand from their perspective the different ways you can word things that are going to resonate the best and be the least offensive. And that's a great tool.
Yeah.
And then it's just practice. It gets easier.
And if you're doing it with all your team members every month, you get really good at it in a couple months, don't you? You start really getting your rhythm into it, and it builds your confidence. Thanks for bringing that up. Thank you both very much. Thanks everybody for downloading and listening to this podcast. We're back on track. We're putting one out every week, if not more often. And we're always so impressed with all the fans we have out there and the number of downloads we're getting on this podcast. And we want to be able to continue to feed you all with some of these tips and best behavior or best practices that we share, and appreciate your consumption of it and your support. And we'll talk to you all next week.